Heaven sent.
What does the word aesthetic mean to you? Is it the visual representation of a person, place, or thing? Or is it something much more complex? The word aesthetic is one that is commonly used in present day, as people have come to find a fascination in the visual stylings of many different things. Whether it's fashion related, a style of media, or even a distinct sound to be achieved in music, there's aesthetic all around us, and it's part of what drives the emotion behind things. With everyone becoming so nostalgic nowadays, it's no secret as to why we're so enthralled with the aesthetics of our past. Take for example, here we have 3 different decades of advertising, and depending on whichever generation you are from, you'll probably feel the closest emotional tie with that specific advert. This is the basis of nostalgia, and it's part of the reason why a simple look into our past can evoke so many different feelings. And with these emotions being so heavily tied into the hobby of gaming, there's one certain studio who's always stood out to me the most for their unique representation. I've been an avid gamer for over 25 years of my life thus far, and have spent my fair share playing through some of the most famed titles to be released in those decades. But when looking back on some of my fondest memories in gaming, I tend to lean heavily on the beautiful works of Squaresoft, a team that prides themselves for creating magical worlds in which their players can sink countless hours into, and a studio that is home to some of the most beloved IPs the world of gaming has ever known. But for this video in particular, I wanted to take some time to revisit and appreciate the aesthetic language of some of their greatest games, discussing their ability to capture emotion as well as the visual nuances that made these titles so memorable. So without further ado, allow me to take you on a journey throughout the early 2000s as we dive into the calming aesthetics of Squaresoft. The humble beginnings of Squaresoft had began with the dreams of a man named Masafumi Miyamoto. Mr. Miyamoto was an employee at the Japanese electronic company Den Sha, which was also owned by his father. He began his career at the establishment in 1983, working as a developer under the company's software division. At this time, the hobby of gaming was steadily rising in popularity, with popular systems such as the Famicom becoming a staple in homes across the globe. Masafumi had taken notice of this trend and decided he wanted to create his own company in which he would use to develop his own games. He had taken notice of the fact that game development in Japan was typically the responsibility of a sole developer, which led him to wonder about what kind of games could be made with the work of an entire team. He aimed to recruit a squad full of graphic designers, writers, and professional programmers in order to make a much larger vision come to life. And with the introduction of Hironobu Sakaguchi becoming the newest member of the team, the genre of role-playing games were about to be reawakened. Masafumi had acquired a large enough team to separate the company from Den Sha, renaming it Square, or better known as Squaresoft. It was hasty to begin work on their very first project. Their first initial attempt was to be based on the television game show Touren Ingen, but without a license being secured to greenlight the release of the game, they turned their attention on developing the 1984 text-based adventure, The Death Trap. With the eventual release of the project, the first game was met with positive reception, and even went on to secure a sequel just a year later. In 1986, the Square team was steadily growing, with a litany of talent being hired in regards to their future projects. They moved their offices into an upscale building in Tokyo, with Miyamoto hoping that their newfound, wealthy appearance would attract more business. But this was a choice that proved to overextend the company, and only furthered their financial woes. And with hopes of turning the company around, it was going to take something next level to bring them back to the top. Miyamoto had questioned his team of directors about what type of game they should make next, with plans to vote on which idea would be the best. Taking note of the success of Enix's Dragon Quest, they eventually decided that a role-playing game would be their best option. With a 5-man team of high-spirited developers being tasked in creating the project, the inception of Final Fantasy had officially began. Now before we get too off track from the main topic of this video, I think that the Final Fantasy series would be the perfect place to begin our journey. And with it being the most popular franchise of Square without a doubt, we've got plenty of ground to cover. So grab your chocobos and prepare to feast your eyes as we begin our journey into the mesmerizing atmosphere of the Final Fantasy series. The Final Fantasy series had officially began its legacy on December 18, 1987. With its very first game in the series being released for Nintendo's Famicom system, the game was met with astounding praise, with many critics taking note of its importance in uplifting the genre of role-playing games. Giving its players a diverse class system, freedom to explore, as well as the convenient use of in-game vehicles for travel, all made Final Fantasy an innovator among its competition, quickly leading to it becoming the head honcho in Square's long list of future projects. They went on to develop 5 more sequels for the Japanese Famicom as well as the NES, all with different storylines and new additions to their ambitious mechanic system. But with the state of gaming in the late 90s quickly shifting its focus to Sony's debut console, the PlayStation, Square knew it was time to depart from their beloved Nintendo roots and take things to a new level with the technological advancements of Sony's latest powerhouse. With the greatly improved memory capabilities of CD-ROM compared to cartridges, they were looking to introduce the use of FMVs, or full motion video, in their next big project. These cutscenes were an effort to immerse the player like never before, and pairing that with their use of 3D models and dynamic backgrounds, they were looking to elevate their next game in every way possible. And with their budget for development costing a whopping $40 million, it's safe to say it was going to be their biggest release to date. But going back to our sole purpose in revisiting this series, I'd like to dive further into the aesthetic language of this game in question, as it was truly the beginning of something special in terms of visuals and atmosphere. So with no time to waste, let's all aboard the Shinra train and begin our retrospective visual feast in Final Fantasy VII on the Sony PlayStation. Now, as you all know, I'm a big fan of an aesthetic menu screen, and upon hearing that classic FF7 menu theme, you're sure to be sent back in time with nostalgic bliss. But moving on to the opening cutscene, begins one of the most memorable intros in Final Fantasy's catalog. And with the previous games in the series having 2D visuals, no cutscenes, to now this, you can only imagine how incredible it was to witness this progression at the time. And pairing these visuals with the iconic work of Nobuo Uematsu, the game's composer, only further exaggerates the magical yet exciting atmosphere that FF7 aims to bring. Now, Nobuo is going to play an incredible role in a lot of the games we're here to discuss, especially in the Final Fantasy series. And while the soundtrack to each game plays an important role in setting the tone, the majority of aesthetic wizardry will be accomplished by none other than the legendary Tetsuya Nomura, a man whose visual work has been an impactful part of Square's look for multiple decades, and is the very reason these games had such a unique feel to them. But going back to the visuals of FF7, the atmosphere of this game was unlike anything ever seen before in the series. Taking influence from New York City, they wanted to create a setting that was unique to its narrative, and somewhat believable to its players, which eventually became Midgar, a bustling metropolis with a dystopian flair, a city controlled by an evil corporation using the life stream of the planet to power its greed. It's very cyberpunk-esque, being a far cry from anything that FF fans had ever seen from the series, and with an obsession of dystopian aesthetic being so prominent in advertisements and media of the late 90s, they really knocked it out of the park with this game's design. But going back to their use of FMVs in game, that's really where it visually shined for me the greatest. Now, I try to keep these videos spoiler-free, so I've opted to use a lot of the earlier cutscenes or ones with lesser context to demonstrate how beautifully crafted they were for their time. But I'd be remiss if I didn't compliment this game for also being a total blast to play through. The use of dynamic environments made the exploration of the game a breath of fresh air, and I always found myself excited to see where the game would take me next. I don't know what it is about pre-rendered backgrounds having such a soothing nature on my brain, but damn, I just can't get enough of the level design in this game. It's like a perfect mix between fantasy and something that's familiar, which for me personally has always made this game a comfort. Its soundtrack is beautiful and expansive, the characters are some of the best the series has ever offered, and its unique world is one that begs to be explored. Final Fantasy VII is a masterpiece to many, for a litany of reasons, but what makes it stand out to me was its introduction into Square's unique visual stylings, a precursor of what's to come, which kept me captivated enough to keep me checking in with the series for multiple decades now. But enough about the 7th entry, as we've got plenty more to discuss within the series. So let's swap out our Buster Sword for the Gunblade, as we move on to Final Fantasy VIII for the PlayStation. With the massive commercial success of Final Fantasy VII, Squaresoft was quick to capitalize on the momentum and hastily begin work on their next big project in the series. This time around, the game's director, Yoshinori Kitase, was hoping to create a perfect blend of fantasy and realism, aiming for characters with a more relatable backstory and realistic proportions. Character designer Tetsuya Nomura fell in line with these wishes by creating a less chibi-like design for its characters, and the game's art director, Yusuke Naora, was hoping to create a world of bright colors and lush atmosphere, which came to be a breath of fresh air compared to the dreary designs of FF7. They wanted the game's world to include a healthy mix of futuristic and present-day themes, taking inspiration from Egyptian, Greek, and French architecture, made sure that their creations would be foreign yet believable, and in my opinion, it's some of their finest work. While they continued their previous use of pre-rendered backgrounds and 3D characters in the game's design, you could tell that the development team at Square had really begun to hone their craft. Whereas they were testing the waters and just getting their feet wet in the development of the previous game, with Final Fantasy VIII, their practice had made perfect. But what is it about this game that made it such a visual spectacle? For me personally, it's the beautifully rendered cutscenes. Beginning with the game's intro, we're met with the scenic view of the ocean. The words, "I'll be here," line the screen, foreshadowing of what's to come in this epic adventure. Transitioning to the vision of a beautiful woman standing in a field of flowers, with a mysterious promise being captioned on screen. A lone feather floats away into the distance, shifting into a sword that finds its way into the earth. And then, we get our first look at one of Square's dopest characters in my opinion, Squall Leonhardt. Man, this cutscene is iconic to me, and everything about it just feels so intoxicating to the eyes. A perfect mix of emotions ranging from captivating to excitement, mystery and wonder. It has it all, and immediately gives the effect of reeling the player in, ensuring they'll be down to stay for the ride to come. I mean, after watching this, you just gotta give it a play. There's so many little intricacies that made this opening so stylish. The use of a bright and vivid color palette, the captivating design of each character, and even the stylish presentation of the fonts used in the captions and title make it all so damn appealing to look at. But moving on to the gameplay, it follows suit in maintaining a stylish presentation, one that in my opinion was the peak of the PlayStation era. Now that may be a bit of a divisive statement for me to make, which would make sense, because Final Fantasy VIII was a very divisive game among its fanbase, with many of its players either loving or hating their experience, mostly due to the game's mechanics and introduction of the junction system. And while the games do play differently in their own respective ways, I personally found that the aesthetic of 8 has always been the winner for me. I guess it all just depends on what you're looking for. A story about pressing world issues and inner conflicts, or a tale about love. They're both great games, and for that reason, it's well worth playing both of them. But if I had the choice of getting to sit back and watch the gameplay for either 7 or 8, it's without a doubt going to be 8. It provides a calming effect to it, creating an experience that's become very nostalgic for many a gamer of the late 90s. Everything about the level design and artistic direction of the characters really makes this one of Square's most aesthetically pleasing titles of the PS1. But for our third and final discussion of the Final Fantasy series, I'd like to dive into my personal favorite game of the entire franchise. One that is still making a regular appearance in my weekend gaming rotation, and a game that never fails to keep me at peace when I need it the most. So without further ado, let's head on over to the PS2 as we take a look into the calming world of Final Fantasy X. Final Fantasy X is a game that I will forever jump at the chance to talk about, as it's already made an appearance in a couple of my previous videos. But for the 6th generation of gamers who were lucky enough to experience this game at release, I'm confident that the majority of y'all will agree on how epic this game truly is. It's like a cold glass of lemonade on a sunny day, and never fails to put me at ease, even in the most stressful of times. Final Fantasy X is the epitome of a comfort game in my opinion, and its captivating visuals paired with a nostalgic soundtrack are everything you could ever ask for in the realms of early 2000s aesthetic. Beginning with the game's menu screen, you're met with an incredibly peaceful composition, the kind of music that almost makes you feel like you're softly floating underwater, looking up to the surface with the view of the sun's rays protruding through the vast blue waters. It's breathtaking, and I've honestly spent multiple occasions just chilling with it playing in the background. But let's not get too hung up on the menu screen, as I'm sure you guys are here to take in some visuals. And as for the introduction cutscene of Final Fantasy X, you're in for one hell of a treat, my friends. It begins with our main character Titus, the star player of an underwater sport called blitzball, who looks to be chilling before his next big game. But all of a sudden, the dome begins to fill with fans, and the face-melting track of Otherworld by X Till I Die X begins to play in the background. Man, this is a cutscene that will forever give me goosebumps. The action of the blitzball game, the shot of Orin overlooking the city and raising his drink to sin, Titus getting airtime to lay down a jet shot, this was the part that had me and my friends restarting the game over and over as kids. I mean, the advancement in visual quality in this game was second to none at the time, and I literally tried to achieve a jet shot on my trampoline for years. This intro was the coolest thing ever to me, and as a 31-year-old man now, I still get just as excited to watch it. Now, it's no secret that this was the best that Final Fantasy had ever looked for its time, and with FMVs having this much detail, how did the gameplay look? Well, it was equally improved, and the level design offered some of its all-time best. From the beautiful island of Besaid, the mesmerizing scenery of Macalania Woods, to the mysterious path of the Jose High Road, there's more than enough scenery to go around, and each location has something unique to offer. The character models are realized in greater detail than any of its predecessors, with the characters having a perfect mix of realism mixed with cartoonish charm. Not to mention, the summons this time around are jaw-dropping. The combat system was refined in a way that was easy for just about anyone to pick up and play, with unique character progression of the spear grid also becoming a welcoming feature. What I love most about the gameplay of Final Fantasy X is how lax it feels compared to most other games, and there's more than enough to keep you busy with a vast array of secret weapons and side quests to uncover. It's a story that covers a multitude of topics and is an emotional roller coaster all around, but the sense of friendship, love, and bravery that's felt throughout the entire narrative is what makes the game feel so wholesome. Much like a warm hug or a pat on the back, the calming nature of Final Fantasy X is one that I will forever hold dear in my heart. If you haven't played it yet, it's a must. It's the perfect story to lose yourself in time and time again, and is a world that I plan to revisit many more times throughout my life. And while the Final Fantasy series has plenty more incredible offerings, I think it's time for us to take a step into a new direction, and look back on another one of Square's most infamous IPs. And for a game that starts out with civilians spontaneously combusting, boy does it still have a calming effect to it. So let's get ready to dive into some late 90s sci-fi goodness, with the 1998 release of Parasite Eve. The late 90s were a hotbed for the genre of survival horror. With the rise in popularity for series such as Resident Evil and Silent Hill, a litany of other strange and macabre tales were being woven among other IPs at the time. And while this next game is technically more of an RPG than survival horror, it's no doubt that it carries an atmosphere that is sure to leave even the most seasoned of horror fans in suspense. Parasite Eve was Square's next big project in their steady run of PlayStation exclusives. Being based on the 1995 novel of the same name, the game was developed to be somewhat of a sequel to the book. The game's director, Hironobu Sakaguchi, wanted to create a tale that was steeped in mystery, creating a blend of horror and science fiction. He had stated that at the time of the game's development, he was careful to avoid watching films of similar themes, as he wanted his ideas to be purely original. They decided it would be best to develop the game using a modified version of the Final Fantasy VII engine, with a large portion of the game's production team being based in the United States, which made sense, considering they were planning to base the game's narrative in New York City. They decided to recruit the iconic penmanship of Tetsuya Nomura in designing the game's main character, a strong and independent woman by the name of Aya Bria. Tetsuya's final draft of Aya had came to be somewhat accidental, as he was working on another character for a separate project at the time, and ended up combining their idea for Aya with his sketches to create her final look, which came to be an excellent outcome. But enough on the game's development, let's take a look into what made it so visually stunning for its time, beginning with the opening cutscene. Now, I'm sure that was more than enough to get the gears in your head turning, like, this game is beautiful. But what is it about? Funnily enough, it's about human combustion. That's right, folks, you heard me correctly. People bursting into flames. Now, as much as this sounds like the work of Hideo Kojima, you'll come to find that things will make a lot more sense as the game goes on. But combining these morbid themes with the charming aesthetics of Square in their game design gives Parasite Eve a unique edge to it. Much like the work on Final Fantasy VIII, they opted for use of realistic looking character models in game, with the welcome tradition of pre-rendered backgrounds. Beginning in the iconic setting of Carnegie Hall, you'll come to find the level of detail in which they included for every inch of the game's level design. Each location has that familiar, almost liminal feel to it, but for me personally, it feels very nostalgic. Transporting you back to the year of 1997 with all of its visual nuances, and even with the absence of voice acting in game, it's an experience that's easy to lose yourself in. The game's soundtrack was composed by Yoko Shimomura, whose name would quickly find a buzz after the game's release. Combining influences of both opera and electronic music, she aimed to achieve a unique sound for the game's atmosphere. And in some cases, the music works incredibly well when you'd least expect it, especially with the battle theme. The soundtrack will go from a suspenseful droning to all of a sudden, this. And instead of feeling creeped out, I just feel like I want to dance with my enemy. But surprisingly enough, it works incredibly well, and everything feels perfectly in place, even when it shouldn't. Pairing this amazing soundtrack with the previously mentioned aesthetic of the game's visuals really brings it all home, and is a captivating look into a world of wonder and just plain weird. The use of CGI rendered cutscenes were also a welcome practice in the game, which is really where the Squaresoft production shines the most for me. There's a very distinct look with their renders, especially in the releases of the late 90s. With Parasite Eve, no detail was spared in creating a cinematic experience for its players, delivering in every way that it intends to, and is sure to satiate even the most diehard of survival horror geeks. If you haven't played this game yet, I'm sure you're more than curious as to what it's about, but I feel that's the best way to go into it. So be sure to give it a playthrough if you haven't, as it really is an experience you'd be doing yourself no favors to miss out on. But as for the next game on our list, it's one that's sure to bring a tsunami of nostalgia with its very mention. So let's get ready to make our journey back to Destiny Islands, as we revisit Kingdom Hearts and its beautiful design. For those familiar with the Kingdom Hearts series, it goes without saying that these games have played an important role in raising an entire generation of gamers. And as far as its concept, it was a bit of a coin toss, taking an ambitious step into a wild direction by combining the vastly diverse worlds of the Final Fantasy series with the Disney universe. Kingdom Hearts was a gamble that could have went horribly wrong, but luckily for Square, they were right on the money. With the very first title of the series being released on March 28, 2002, Kingdom Hearts was met with critical acclaim, with many critics raising praise about the game's impressive blend of action and RPG mechanics, as well as the game's charming artistic direction. And speaking of artistry, that's exactly what we're here to discuss. So let's take things back to the opening cutscene and revisit one of Square's most stylish of intros.
I've been having these weird thoughts lately. Like, is any of this for real? Or not?
Everything about this opening cutscene is so iconic to me, and as much as I wish I could allow the intro song to play in this video, YouTube will give me a swift karate chop to the neck if I don't mute it. But if you know how amazing the intro song is, then you know. And just the sheer amount of nostalgia it still brings to me after all these years, it's a certified hood classic in my book. But without harping too much on the sweet voice of Utada Hikaru, what also makes this intro so great is its captivating visuals. If I had to encompass the emotions of a childhood summer, I feel like this cutscene would do the trick, and is a perfect introduction for one of Square's greatest series. But moving on to the visuals in game, its charming aesthetic never skips a beat, and the character design is spectacular in every way. As you have probably guessed, Tetsuya Nomura was the man in charge of character design, with his work being a staple at Square in the Final Fantasy series, and with him also taking the role of the game's director,
You can see his incredibly stylish flair being painted on every inch of the game's design, featuring a stunning variety of Final Fantasy characters such as Cloud, Tidus, Aerith, and even the beloved Moogle, along with a massive variety of Disney characters and influences, made the game a breath of fresh air for many, and when looking at how they visually combine the two, it's honestly impressive. The concept of this game almost seemed like something out of a fever dream, but for it to flow so wonderfully is nothing short of a miracle. Not only does it look amazing, but the returning work of Yoko Shimomura is a welcoming choice for the game's soundtrack. While the majority of the soundtrack is completely original, she also made use of an assortment of melodies taken from Disney films, and aimed to create an emotional yet compelling ambiance throughout the game. And as for the previously mentioned intro song, our boy Tetsuya had handpicked out Utada Hikaru in creating the game's opening theme, which was originally only included in the Western release of the game, with it later being added in the Japanese re-release of Kingdom Hearts Final Mix. This was the first time that Utada had ever created a song for a video game, but shortly after the game's launch, the opening theme of Simple and Clean had ended up selling over 860,000 copies within its first year of release, with a wide array of different versions and remixes being released later on down the line. So with the visuals and sounds in-game being highly satisfactory, how about the gameplay? To keep it short, it's a pleasant surprise. While Square had prided themselves on being the best in the biz for the genre of role-playing games, they wanted Kingdom Hearts to play a bit different in terms of combat. Much like the active time battle mechanics we've seen in the more recent Final Fantasy VII remake, this tradition had began in Final Fantasy IV, and in my opinion, was perfected in the Kingdom Hearts series, allowing you to freely roam around the battlefield, using an array of dodges, parries, and jumps to avoid your enemy's attacks. You can swap between melee, magic, and item usage in real time, and even go on to collect a litany of different special attacks for Sora and the squad throughout the game. Kingdom Hearts is an excellent example of how a masterful eye and careful planning can make even the most bizarre of concepts work. With the visual stylings of the great Tetsuya Nomura crafting the game's beautiful characters and world, it's a no-brainer as to why it's such an aesthetically pleasing masterpiece. The Kingdom Hearts series has gone on to release a variety of wonderful sequels and spin-off games throughout its legacy. And while many fans of the series will agree on the opinion that Kingdom Hearts 2 is quite possibly the peak of the series, the first game will always hold a special place in my heart. It's a staple in my childhood memories, and is a game that continues to bring me a comforting effect even to this day. But for the last and final entry of our series, I thought we could revisit one of the more obscure titles of Squaresoft, and cover one of their most unique games to date. So let's get ready to hop in the driver's seat and burn some rubber in the Japanese exclusive release of Racing Lagoon on the Sony PlayStation. What do you get when you combine the RPG prowess of Squaresoft with the aesthetic culture of import cars and street racing? Well, you get the next game on our list. By far one of Square's most ambitious titles to date, and is one that has flown well below the radar due to it being a Japanese exclusive. But thanks to modern day emulation and the prestigious efforts of Hilltop Works in fully translating the game to English, Racing Lagoon is now fully available for Western enthusiasts. And to much surprise, it's one of the most unique games I've probably ever played. You begin the game as the newest member of a street racing syndicate called Team BLR, or Bay Lagoon Racing, in which you begin your journey into uncovering the mystery of a local racing legend, as well as piecing together the details of your forgotten past. The game's default name for this character is Sho, but I thought Vin Akasaki had a nice ring to it, so I punched in the characters and braced myself for speed. Being placed in 1999 Yokohama, you'll find yourself entangled in a nasty rivalry between your team and a group of riders called the Night Racers. You decide to go out for your first race one night and end up going toe-to-toe with the legendary racer labeled as the fastest legend, a driver that every racer in the city has aspired to beat, and for our main character, it's become his #1 mission. But victory will not come easy, and you're going to need to put in some serious road miles before you're ready to step up to the legend. So in the meantime, you'll spend your time racing other drivers, winning upgraded parts from their vehicles, and eventually building the speed demon of your dreams. But for the most part, this doesn't sound much different than any other street racing game. Where's the RPG elements, you may ask? Well, that's where the game gets interesting. While the racing aspects in-game are quite familiar to other simulation racers of the same era, pretty much everything else is based on RPG mechanics. Vehicle upgrades, the random racing encounters, text-based dialogue, and even the way you move about the city. It's like Gran Turismo and Final Fantasy did a fusion dance and made quite possibly the most unique racing game of the late 90s. But what makes this game so special for me personally is how undeniably stylish it is. It's very reminiscent of the 1998 anime series Initial D, but stays very unique due to the iconic work of Squaresoft and their gift in making the world so inviting. There's plenty of areas to explore and faces to interact with as you cruise around the streets of Yokohama, and its contagious soundtrack of jazz and techno fusion tracks are a wonderful pairing for the game's bustling nightlife. I mean, just take a second to soak in these vibes for a minute. Pretty smooth, huh? Now, as we had mentioned before, you're trying to make a name for yourself on the streets and build up a ride that's fast enough to compete with your hometown hero. And to do so, you'll need to take down the wide variety of other racers that can be found throughout the city. Much like you've seen in Midnight Club or Need for Speed, a racer who flashes their lights are looking for a challenge. But in Racing Lagoon, these guys will drive around the city at top speeds, and if they collide with you, you better be ready for a race. Now, it's necessary that each driver puts something on the line with each race, meaning you can pick and choose which parts of your opponent's vehicle you would like to keep upon winning. It's like a pink slip, but you just get a piece of their vehicle. But this also comes at a price, as you will have to spend hard-earned currency as well on these parts. That way you're not just building a supercar in a couple of matches. It's going to take some time. You also earn XP, which enhances your driving skills over time and really scratches the itch of a serial grinder, much like myself. I love the way progression works in this game, and the idea of building your perfect car piece by piece is really rewarding in my opinion. But we're not just here to harp on how well the game plays. What I'm really here to talk about is how wonderful it looks. Opting for use of FMVs with a mix of stylish text-based narration, the game feels very familiar to what we've come to see from Square in the past, but setting these practices in the world of street racing really takes things to another level. For example, most racing games are no stranger to showing replays after a match, but in the case of replays in this game, they will typically include some further dialogue in the progression of the story, and maybe even some inner dialogue from your character. Along with your ability to move around the city, interacting with other racers, and even stopping off for a hot cup of coffee, all these things are important in making the story feel more believable and immersive in your experience. Whereas most games of the genre are so heavily focused on speed and quickly getting you from one race to another, Racing Lagoon puts you into a world that you really want to take your time and appreciate. And not only does it share a calming effect like all the other games on this list, but it's a game that I could see doing incredibly well, even being released in present day to a wider audience. And I'd even go as far as to say, I wouldn't change a thing about it. The overall presentation is something I found myself admiring, and the game's catchy music, interesting world and characters kept me wanting to get back on the streets and find out more of what's to come. There's no such thing as a perfect game, but in the realms of RPG racing titles, this is as good as it gets in my opinion. As I had previously mentioned, the game has been fully translated to English if you want to give it a chance for yourself, and I definitely recommend grabbing it from CD Romance. That's where I found my emulation copy. But anyways, I think that just about sums up everything we had to discuss in this list so far. There are plenty of other great IPs and series I could have continued to include from Square in this list, but for the sake of keeping things on brand with the channel, I decided to include the ones I had the greatest experiences with. But with that being said, please feel free to drop any games you think I missed out on down below. Sometimes you guys really put me on game with some great recommendations, or push me to play something I've been wavering on. I appreciate you all for tagging along with me for this journey, and hopefully it brought some much needed peace to your day. But until next time, take care and stay safe, my friends. I hope to see you in the next one. Peace out.